All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Michael-Ruse, who is a professor of philosophy and the director of the program in the history and philosophy of science at Florida State University. He specializes in the philosophy of biology and is well known for his work on the relationship between science and religion, the creation evolution controversy, and the demarcation problem in science. Lastly, he's the author of many books, including his latest, Understanding the Christianity Evolution Relationship. So, Dr. Roos, thanks for coming on today.
I should explain, I am retired now. I'm 83. So
Okay.
I've been I taught for 35 years in Southern Ontario at a university there, University of Guelph. And then to avoid compulsory retirement, which I needed to do because I'd married one of my students and had a new family, and I
Okay.
was faced with compulsory retirement, I was offered a job down here. So I spent 20 years down here in Florida.
Ah,
So
okay.
so that's why, I mean, as you can tell from my accent, I wasn't born in North America. I was born in England, and then after getting a mediocre undergraduate degree, I did what failures do in England. I went to the colonies. So I went to Canada and spent 40 years there.
Okay, makes sense. So, just starting off then, how did you first get interested in the relationship between science and religion?
Okay, well, that's a good question. First of all, I was born in 1940, so at the beginning of the Second World War, and I was raised as a Quaker. My parents were Quakers, and when I was 13, I was sent to a Quaker boarding school. Now, one of the things that the thing about Quakers is, on the one hand, they don't have any creeds or dogmas or anything like that. On the other hand, they are very big on people having to work things through for themselves. So I very much grew up with discussing, talking about things, and obviously talking about religion and context of religion. I mean, for instance, Quakers are pacifists. We just had the Second World War, which was, as they say, a good war in the sense that Hitler had to be fought and stopped. So it was a big question. Is pacifism an acceptable sort of position to take? So I grew up arguing about religion and its relationship to other things. I mean, again, for instance, in England in the 1950s, homosexuality was illegal, and there were over 1,000 men in jail because they were caught in homosexual activity. Uh, Even though, as everybody said, sending a gay homosexual to prison is a bit like sending a drunkard to a brewery. But anyway, so the point I'm making is I grew up trying to sort of place religion, as it were, against other things like that. And then at school, I did math, physics, and chemistry, as we all did in those days. But it became clear to me when I went to university that I wasn't happy in this. So I took up doing philosophy as well. And so here I am then, a philosopher, but also having done a lot of science, a philosopher of science. And although by the time I was 20, God and I parted ways, I was still very interested in religion, but not in a hostile way. I always like to joke, you could never be a new atheist if you're raised a Quaker. I mean, you don't hate Christianity.
Yeah.
When I sometimes see the Southern Baptists, that pushes me. But anyway, so these were naturals, and then I got interested in Darwin. Again, I'm going on a bit, but it's all part of the story. And I've always been absolutely fascinated by the Victorians, Victorian Britain. And I used to read Dickens. I read Dickens for pleasure, and I loved Victorian architecture, like St Pancras Station. So, of course, working on Darwin was a natural for me. And so, as it were, by the time I was in my 30s, I was being pushed into science and religion. And then something occurred which dragged me, as it were, because this was the time when the creationist movement started to gather steam, as it were. And through the 70s, the creationists were getting more and more visible and, shall we say, successful. At least they were making a louder noise. And I found myself debating with with atheists atheists, creationists a couple of times, and to show off. I was pretty good at it because, on the one hand, growing up as a Quaker, I was used to arguing, and then having had by that time 15 years of undergraduate teaching, I knew that a good joke is worth 10 arguments. So I was okay at that. And then I got involved in being a witness in a trial in Arkansas in 81, where the state had passed something which they called the balanced treatment law, which said if you're going to teach evolution, then you must also teach creationism, or creation science, as they were doing. And the ACLU got involved, saying this is a violation of the separation of church and state. And so they brought in a pile of people, I mean, like the late Stephen Jay Gould, for instance, and as witnesses. And I think somewhat hesitantly, they wondered and then decided they really had to have a philosopher, although, nobody wants to get a philosopher on the witness stand, because first of all, with we're the brightest people in the room. Second, we know that. And third, we tend to show off about it. And fourth, we get screwed up before we'd finished very long. Anyhow, they finally decided they had to use me. And as I, again, immodestly, it turned out I was a pretty crucial part of the attack, because we weren't, you see, the point is, you couldn't say creationism is bad science, because there's nothing in the US Constitution which says you can't teach bad science.
Right, of course.
What it says is you can't teach religion. And of course, then you're right into the philosophical issues of what is science, what is religion, why don't they meet, why aren't they like this? And there were a lot of philosophical issues coming up. And let me just go into it just a little bit more, because Thomas Kuhn, of whom I'm sure you heard, the author of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talked in terms of paradigms. And he said these are kind of incommensurable. They're like political positions. They don't, as it were, like, by being a Trumpite or somebody from Bernie Sanders type. This isn't a question like that. We're going, and of course, so what the creationists were doing was saying, oh, we've got two paradigms. We've got evolution and we've got creation science. But paradigms, as it were, don't meet like that. They're going in different ways. And so, yeah, we don't mind evolution, but you've got to recognize ours is a separate paradigm and has just as much legitimacy and should be taught. So obviously, we were being dragged into philosophical issues about science, religion, the relationship. Is it, for instance, everybody had heard of Popper. You can falsify science. I mean, the Earth is. You say the Earth is flat. Well, you bloody well can go out and show it isn't. Whereas religion is a lot more difficult. I mean, if I say Jesus died on the cross for our sins, how do I disprove that? I mean, I suppose I could disprove it by saying Jesus never existed, but let's agree, which I think basically we all do, that Jesus did exist, that he did get hung up, he did die. Now, how then do you falsify an interpretation?
Sure.
Which said he did this in order to, as it were, to save us or wash away our sins. And so I was very much involved then in science and religion at that time. And of course, being a philosopher, I mean, I was always interested in it, but with my Quaker background, this kind of argumentation and discussion was obviously, it was a bit different from the argumentation of my childhood. I was no longer worried about pacifism, although one had been interested during the Vietnam War. But no, my thing was creationism, creation science, and then as it morphed into intelligent design theory. So this became both, well, I didn't teach a lot of it. I taught some, but I'm always dubious. I don't like to spend my classes doing propaganda. I mean, you can do it a bit at the graduate level, but at the undergraduate level, you're just doing Baker, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant. I mean, that's your job. And so I didn't do an awful lot at the undergraduate level, a certain amount at the graduate level, and particularly after I came down here to Florida and started my own little program on history and philosophy of science. But again, you don't want to do the same class, every year. You change it, and according to what's going on, you alter things. But as
Sure.
I say, science and religion became, I suppose, my thing, and again, it sounds like I'm showing off, but in my late 20s, when I was writing what I called a thesis in those days, but what Americans would call a dissertation, I discovered I had a flair for writing. I mean, of course, having done math, physics, chemistry, I didn't realize this. But then suddenly I discovered that I could write 3,000 words a day, day after day. And so this means I've written a lot of books. I remember talking to Steve Gould about this. He said, "Yes, Mike," he said, "but nobody will think you're a serious thinker if you do that much." Anyway, so I this got reflected into what I was doing. But I would say, perhaps more recently, they always say, you become an atheist when you're 20, but by the time you're 70, you get on board again with Jesus. Can't afford to make mistakes. Well, I've discovered I had at 80, 83, no more interest in declaring that I'm a Christian than I had when I was 25.
Sure.
However, what I do note is perhaps they've always been there, but I'm increasingly aware that the kind of moral issues that concern Quakers, things like ought one fight in a war against Hitler. My father, for instance, he was a pacifist, but he worked with Italian prisoners of war, taking them out to the fields. Now, was this legitimate? I mean, wasn't he, in doing this, freeing somebody else to go to war? I mean,
Yeah.
can one do that? So, I'm not saying, the point is, and what makes these interesting is, by and large, these are not black and white questions.
Sure.
These are
Yeah.
questions, for instance, if you join the Friends Ambulance Unit in the First World War, a lot of Quakers went over to the battlefields and worked, rescuing people in no man's land and doing that sort of thing, getting killed, very brave people. Is that legitimate? But you're not shooting other people. You're not trying to kill Germans. Is this, and you're also saying, if I see an injured German, I'm going to give him exactly the treatment I'm going to give an injured Englishman. As I say, the thing is, Quakers get involved in these. And of course, Quakers are big on moral issues. We don't spend a lot of time, or we didn't spend a lot of time on the theology, is time on the cross, atonement for our sins and that sort of thing. That's not where Quakers are at. They do have strong beliefs. For instance, they believe in that of God in every person. And that's what, for instance, makes a wild tiger, a dangerous tiger, not an evil thing, but it's what makes Heinrich Himmler evil, because he's got that of God in him and he's turned his back on it. So, as I say, these are the things I grew up with. And I have found, perhaps they've always been there, but they're getting more overt as I get older, that I'm more and more concerned with moral issues. And I've just recently wrote a book on hate, published by Oxford, where basically what I'm saying is, how do you tackle some of these moral issues? And what has evolutionary theory got to tell us about them? The book I'm writing at the moment, I've got 4 topics, which are all very, you say you're a historian or oral historian for Indiana. Well, I know what you'd be doing if you're an oral historian for Florida.
Sure. Yeah.
You'd be dealing, one, with immigrants. DeSantis shipping those, 50 unknowing immigrants up to Martha's Vineyard. So that's one thing. Second, you'd be dealing with blacks and the whole question of blacks. We're a state which, dear God, teaches their middle school students that slavery had good effects because people could learn jobs.
Yeah. Pretty
Third,
crazy.
third, homosexuals. This is a state where not only can you not talk about homosexuals to school children, but you can't show any evidence of approving of it. So somebody who's married, for instance, are they going to have to spend their whole teaching career in denial about this? I mean, what's happening is, of course, is a lot of them say, to hell with this. I can't teach in Florida. I'll have to go somewhere else. And fourth, women. And of course, again, Florida, for instance, has just enacted that it's after 6 weeks, no abortions. Well, of course, the point is, we all know a lot of women don't really know they're pregnant by that time,
Right.
and that sort of thing. So these are issues. For instance, I'm writing about at the moment implication of Darwinism for these sorts of things. I
Yeah.
mean, for instance, I mean, what does Darwinism have to say about race? Does it, does it help to affirm the thing or not? I mean, just to give you an example, most obvious thing between us and African Americans is that we're white. I wouldn't describe you as lily white, but we're white and they're not, they're black. Now, the question is, why? And of course, we know because, in the jungle, or in Africa, you've got the sun beating down on you. So
Right.
the melanin is a good protection. Up in Iceland, you don't have the sun, so you need to be white to get the vitamin C and all of these things, but has absolutely sod all to do with intelligence.
Right. Right. Of
The
course.
fact that somebody's, doing something, a hunter-gatherer in the Congo, or a hunter-gatherer, let's say in South Spain, it has nothing to do with intelligence,
Yeah.
and there's no reason why they shouldn't be equally or more intelligent. So these are the sorts of things that I grapple with in a big way. As science and religion, yes, but I think and I think a lot of us have moved on from, is the Bible true or not? Does Darwinism conflict? Obviously, people who are new atheists are still living with that. But I think a lot of us, at least at the philosophical level, would say, you know, can we get beyond Richard Dawkins, please?
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and can we actually, discuss some of these issues at a more temperate level, as it were? So, as I say, this is what I do, and I wouldn't say, certainly, I would not say that I never deal with issues like, can you prove the existence of God and those sort of things. In fact, I think Darwinism obviously has a lot to say about adaptation and design and that sort of thing. But I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, is that we've broadened out, and I don't think I'm unique in this, but for me, I think particularly because of my childhood and my background, the whole question of science and religion at the moment, what's really concerning me are the moral issues that come out of this rather than other sorts of things. Well, I always do far too much talking. Okay, it's your turn.
Sounds good. No, that's a really good background you're giving on what you do. So I'm curious. Then you mentioned that you've debated creationists before, and when people who are very familiar with science and scientific concepts, debate people. I suppose that can always be hit or miss in terms of how productive that conversation is. Have you found that debates with creationists have been successful? I guess it depends a lot also on who your audience was at the debate, of
Well, it's
course.
very interesting you asked me this question because a month ago, literally a month, 5 weeks ago, I spent a week in Poland at Krakow. It's the city
Yep.
down in the south. And it turned out I was invited because they wanted me to debate with, who was it? The intelligent design person, Michael Behe. And he was there, and I was there, and a couple of others there. And we were debating it. Turned out we had an audience of 200. And I think there might have been 10 people in that audience sympathetic to me.
Yeah.
But that's how it usually
Yeah.
works. I mean, when I used to debate people like Dwayne T. Gish and Henry Morris in the 1970s, I mean, I can still remember the first one I did was in the basketball arena of Northwestern University. Now it's a hell of a big arena. I mean, I don't know, but certainly they could have 5,000 people there, and they did. I laugh. I reckon at least 20 of them believed in evolution. And so at one level, it was clear that this wasn't a serious scientific discussion. This was more almost, I mean, it was almost like Saturday Night Live. It was,
Yeah.
I mean, what would happen is we have the time slots. Well, the person, you'd have two on each side. So I'd always have a regular scientist like I did in Krakow. Well, the trouble with regular scientists is they say, okay, George, George Ping Pong, it's your turn. Well, George Ping Pong will spend at least the first 15 minutes explaining about Mendel's laws. And then
Yeah.
he's just getting into the double helix when, boom, your time's cut off. And he said, well, I didn't get to it at all. Well, sorry, your time's
Yeah.
cut off. Well, the thing
Yeah.
is, again, as I say, I I had done so much undergraduate teaching, and my personality, I spotted what was going on very quickly. And as I say, I was quite serious about this. I realized a good joke was worth 10 arguments. Didn't mean to say I didn't do this stuff seriously, but I made damn sure that if I'd got 15 minutes, at the end of my 15 minutes, I was in a position to say, and that's it, folks. That's why it's this way. Thank you. And but I realized it was difficult to know what. I mean, on the one hand, it was a vaudeville, and it wasn't, what shall I say, intellectually very forward looking, like it wasn't in Krakow. On the other hand, they're going to do it, so they need people to take them on. And I mean, and I'm not the only one. I mean, Steve Gould was fantastic at this. I mean, I'm not, and Langdon Gilkey, the creation, the Protestant theologian from Chicago, was really, really effective. So please understand, I'm not saying I was uniquely able to do this,
Of
but I,
course. Yeah.
but but I think we all realized that it was important that we get out there and say these things, if only for our own sake, to realize at least we've done our bit in opposing it.
Yeah.
And so I never had any moral qualms about doing it. As I say, I like doing this sort of thing, and I enjoy the traveling. Never made any money out of it, but you usually got a couple of good meals. And
The debates that you took part in, obviously, when debating, it can be tough, when the crowd is obviously being, very much on one side of an issue. So that's always a difficulty. But I know that you've also had, some issues, as you mentioned before, with sort of the philosophy of the new atheist movement and their view of religion and science, the compatibility between the two. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
yeah, well, first of all, I tend to get on really well with my opponents. I think I got on better with the creationists than with the Darwinians. But one year, no kidding, I contributed to the Festschrift of Richard Dawkins at the same time of Philip Johnson, the guy who invented intelligent design theory. I think that was something of a record. So, but the thing is, you see, again, I don't want to make it into a, well, I do want to make it into a theme. There's no question that my Quaker background doesn't approve of the kind of strident atheism of the new atheists. In fact, I think I'm with Darwin on this. I mean, Darwin was an agnostic. There's no question that he didn't want anything to do with the atheists. He thought they were rather vulgar. And there's an element of me feels that too. Uh, that it's not just a question of being right or wrong. I don't know that it's a bit like it's a bit like Billy Graham on the other side. Uh, okay, I don't want to be convinced by emotion. I want to be convinced by arguments or laying it out and that sort of thing. I think this is what worries. I mean, there's no question, for instance, that Richard Dawkins. I mean, overall, of course, I agree with him far more than I agree with Philip Johnson or the others.
Right.
So let's not fool around on that. And there's some things I agree very strongly with Richard Dawkins on. For instance, the Catholic abuse of children and the cover up which has gone along with it. I mean, I don't think any of us would doubt there's a very good reason why this has all happened, namely that Catholic priests aren't allowed to marry. You're
Right.
18 years old, and you become a priest. It's wonderful, wonderful. But the trouble is, at 25, you wake up and you realize you've got a dick between your legs, and also no women, but you've got the priest has this kind of power, and
Yeah.
these things happen. Now, I'm not excusing anybody who does it, but I would condemn far more the institution of the Catholic Church, which leads young people into these sort of situations where they do behave that way. And so I'm 100% with Richard Dawkins on things like this. Where we go from there,
Yes.
as I say, I mean, Dawkins can be so dismissive. I mean, you take the ontological argument, he just sneers at it and then says the mark of a philosopher is you believe the impossible. Well, yes and no. I mean, the ontological argument, I mean, some philosophers think there's something. By and large, philosophers don't think the ontological argument is valid. But on the other hand, we kind of admire what shall I say, the moxie of somebody who's got the nerve to put it forward. And of course, it leads us into a lot of interesting and important arguments or discussions about the nature of necessity. What would it mean to say somebody is a necessary being? I mean, Christians would certainly say that God, who created God? And they would say, no, you can talk about who created us because we're contingent. But God, at some level, is a necessary being. And so it's like, who created God is about a bit like asking, when did 2 plus 2 first starting equaling 4? Now, the point is, I think there's important philosophical discussions here, as there are. I mean, of course there are, because Hume was the one who said there's no such thing as necessary existence. So these are, I think, important questions. And I guess, partly it's, territory. I get a bit pissed off when Dawkins just gives my profession the back of the hand. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stupid stuff and pointless stuff that philosophers argue about, but it's not all that way. Just the same with biology. I mean, I don't really give a damn about Darwin's finches, but I can see why it might be important and all of these things. So there you go. So that's what gets to me is, as I say, I'm a little bit with Darwin on this. New atheists strike me as rather vulgar. And of course, the other
Yeah.
thing is, as the sociologists have pointed out, first of all, new atheists tend to be a very elite group. They all, speak from prestigious universities like Berkeley or Oxford or these sorts of things, even Tufts, where Dan Dennett is. So they're all doing that. And, well, as I say, and the other thing is, they not only anti-religion, but often they're awfully prejudiced. I mean, the sorts of things that Sam Harris says about Muslims.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I know a lot of things about Muslims I don't agree with. I mean, I think a woman should have the right or not to put something on her hair. I mean, you might say, yes, if you want to be a good Muslim, then we expect you to do this. However, we're not going to tell anybody and everybody who lives in our country that women must wear,
Right.
head
Of
things. So,
course. Yeah.
I but when you look at somebody like Sam Harris on the question of Muslims, it's put it this way: if he said this same things about Jews, my God, we'd all be up in arms. But I don't think that I don't think the new atheists are any better when it comes to Muslims. So, as I say, but that's one of the major reasons I dislike. Dislike is too strong a term. I don't lie awake. I don't lie awake worrying about them. I lie awake worrying about Trump. I lie awake particularly worrying about DeSantis
Sure.
and the evil thing. I mean, and I'm using the word, deserve it. The evil things I think he's done in Florida in the last year. So I do worry about that, but I can't honestly say I lie awake worrying either about Philip Johnson or about Dan Dennett.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious then, because obviously that's kind of one of the, I guess, one of the issues when it comes to science communication is what's the approach with people that are on the fence about evolution or the Big Bang, and how do you communicate scientific concepts to them? Do you think that the approach that a lot of new atheists take when it comes to just kind of like scolding people for being religious, do you think that kind of reinforces anti-science beliefs among the religious community because they're feeling like, hey, this guy's just being a jerk to me. Why would I believe him?
Well, I suspect whether or not the atheists existed, this the anti-science people would have these beliefs anyway.
Sure.
So at a certain level, I suppose it helps crystallize one's thinking in these
Yeah. Okay.
sorts of ways.
Yeah.
But I mean, personally, and of course, I'm in this. I'm not a disinterested observer. I want to
Yeah.
say new atheists don't have that much influence. But of course,
Yeah.
I'm a philosopher, so one of the
Yeah.
things I'm faulting them for is not doing it my way. So, as I say, I'm hardly a disinterested commenter on these sorts of things. But I, I, I think there are better ways of dealing with these things than you know what so often what the new atheists do.
Yeah. I also think that, I mean, I grew up in Kansas, which is, part of the Bible Belt in the United States, as they say. And I mean, I've always gotten the impression that, the average churchgoer really doesn't think deeply about questions of like, is evolution compatible with with Christianity? I think the average person doesn't really think much about that. So I think that, people would be open to it as long as the concept doesn't feel like it's going to contradict their faith. Um,
Ben, before we go any further,
yeah.
you're from Kansas.
Yes.
Look at the T-shirt I'm wearing. What
This
kind of dog is that?
looks like I'm having trouble seeing from the camera angle what exactly that dog. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, it's just like the dog from Wizard of Oz. Yeah,
Yes, it's a Can Terrier, just
yeah,
like Toto. And
yeah.
we've got two of them just down the hall.
That's
So,
funny.
but anyhow, sorry, I forgot everything you were saying because when you said Kansas, I just simply said that there
Yeah,
are priorities, and
right.
letting you know that I'm a can. I mean, I'm worse than you atheists when it comes to Can Terriers. Okay.
Fair enough. No, but yeah, I was just saying that from my experiences, the average churchgoer doesn't think very deeply about whether evolution is compatible or not with Christianity, and I don't think many people would necessarily even care about evolution being accepted as long as it doesn't feel like it's an attack on their faith or will contradict their faith. I mean, obviously, there's many people that are Protestants and Catholics that believe in evolution. So it just kind of depends on what a person's exposed to, I guess.
Yes, I mean, there's obviously, if you're a 6-day creationist, like well, I suppose
Like,
Jehovah's Witness or
yeah,
Seventh-day Adventist, I mean, yeah, you're just going to clash with Darwinism because Darwinism doesn't believe in 6 days. But let's face up to it. If you're a 6-day creationist, you're going to conflict with Orthodox
yeah,
Christian theology
yeah,
since the time of Augustine. Augustine dealt with this. He said, you know, the Bible says that what is it? The sun's created on the first day or something. Oh, God creates light on the first day and the sun on the third day or something. And Augustine says that can't be. But obviously, God speaks in metaphorical language to people so they can understand what the real import is. And I think an awful lot of Christians, let me say, conservative Christians, would say, that's not where dis- disagreements come about. Disagreements come about if you think that Darwinism impinges on free will, and
right.
we're just automata or something like that. And of course, that one could get into discussions about that. But as I say, yes, I agree with you, and I think if at some level the new atheists, as it were, are blocking this, which I can well see that they do, then not only do I not agree with new atheists, I mean I think they're doing positive harm there, as I think they do positive harm about Muslims. I mean,
Yeah,
some of the things that Richard Dawkins has said about Muslims, I mean, you know, you really shouldn't say it. It's about
sure.
on a par with saying slavery was a good thing because people learned trade skills.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, this. I mean, I've spent time living in Muslim countries, and you know, I've definitely found there are many Muslims that are pretty moderate about their views
Of course they
on
are.
on things, and are willing to accept evolution, for example. It just totally depends on people. Obviously, if you're talking about someone from like the Taliban or something in Afghanistan, that's
Yeah,
very different than the average
very much
Muslim.
so.
So, um, now, so what would be your message then? And this is probably something that you've given at various talks, but what's your message to like people that are skeptical of evolution, and they feel like, oh, this is a could potentially uh, threaten like my religious beliefs or my faith? What's your kind of like summary version of a response to that?
Well, read my books.
Read your books.
Yeah.
What's something you could say that could get people interested in reading your books if they're
Yeah.
skeptical of
Well, I mean,
evolution?
the point is, no, but actually, that's not quite such a flip answer as it might seem.
Yeah,
Uh, because what I want to say is, first of all, folks, if we're going to talk about this, we have to make the effort to talk seriously. I mean, if you just want to flip it off or something like that, well, you can, but at some level, we're not in dialogue. I'm just like I'm not in dialogue with creationists. I'm not in dialogue with new atheists. I mean, I want to say, folks, if you want to talk about these things seriously, then let's talk about them seriously. Let's do some reading. I mean, you don't have to read The Origin of Species, but there's many good books on modern books on evolutionary theory, which spell it out and try to tell people how it works and that sort of thing. Now, if you if you're not prepared to make that kind of effort, then you know dialogue's over before we even have one.
right.
But of course, don't forget, I'm an educator. I'm a college prof. What do you expect me to say? You know,
Yeah,
I mean, what do you expect me to say? So I think if you're going to ask these questions seriously, and look, I'm not pretending, obviously, that everybody is going to have either the IQ or the training to do the things that I presume you and I would think we could do. But that doesn't mean to say we have to be condescending. I
of
mean,
course. Yeah,
look, when you're teaching children about ideas, you're not going to hand them Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. You're not.
yeah,
Uh, but it doesn't mean to say that, let's say, Kant's practical reason doesn't mean to say that you can't talk to children. I mean, again, sort of things that I was doing as you know, at the age of 10 or more. Uh, how does morality work? Is it a question of trying to make everybody happy? And if you made 9 people happy, but one person very unhappy, would that be morally okay? Or is it ever right to treat people as means rather than as ends? Which of course we do often. Yes, I'm going to make an example of you. I'm going to send you to prison for 10 years. Not as it were, let's think about your needs and everything. So, as I say, these are the sorts of things that Kant and Mill and others deal with. But I don't think you have to put it, you don't have to insist that they read the Critique of Practical Reason.
sure.
And so I would say there's all sorts of books and things designed, written and designed for various age levels. And I don't think it's at all condescending to somebody to say, well, don't know anything about it. Why don't you start off with this book for teenagers or something like that? I mean,
Right.
let me put it this way: I'm certainly not too proud to do that. I mean, if somebody said to me, "Well, Mike, you really don't have a good grasp, let's say, of Muslim theology. This is a book that we use in our Muslim classes to teach our kids. It's aimed for you know high school kids or whatever." You might find I would not in any sense think that you're looking down on me for
Yeah.
suggesting that. In fact, in many respects, I might say, yeah, that would be a great help. Let's start there, and then let's get together and discuss it.
Yeah.
So,
I think
um,
that's a good point. Because one of the things I think a lot of people struggle with when they're not very familiar with, religious communities. I think you and I both have a background where we've been around a lot of people that are fairly religious. Um, and, I think it is important to have a decent understanding if you're going to be a science communicator at all of any concepts to have a grasp of the religions that you're
yeah,
talking to people from.
yes.
Because if you can't, I think, bring a scientific concept sort of and communicate it in a way that uh, makes sense to them within their worldview, it's very hard to have any type of conversation or connection with someone in the first
No,
place.
I agree with you 100% on that. No, I agree with you 100%. I mean, the point is, Ben, I I had 55 years of real heaven. 5 minutes into my first class back in 1965, I realized I was going to do that for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
And I don't think, for instance, if I were teaching, let's say, pure mathematics, I would have felt that way. Maybe other people do. But the thing is, I love arguing. I mean, I grew up with this. This is what I really like. And this is what I like doing, interacting with students on these sorts of things. I always say to people, if you agree with everything I've said, then you're obviously not taking me seriously. So
yeah,
you know, this is my business. So when it comes to something like science and religion, I'm more than happy to talk about these things, argue about these things, all of those sorts of things. That certainly doesn't worry me. And in fact, I've published more than one book with religious people. I got one called "Taking God Seriously," where the other there's me, and the other guy is a an Augustinian monk, and we're arguing about these things. And I think this is a great way to do things. So I'm not against, certainly not against talking about these things.
yeah.
It's just I I want to talk about them rather than get up on an orange box and preach about them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's I think the big concern, and one of the things I've kind of always been skeptical about, like when it comes to having a conversation, with someone who's religious, how do you have a conversation that's productive rather than one where it's just like, oh, well, you're wrong and you're wrong, and you just like throwing facts at each other that don't really make sense to an audience and no one really cares about. If it's like a sport, I feel like where it's like
Yeah,
my team versus your team instead of a conversation, it probably
yeah.
doesn't lead to much development. So,
No, I agree. No, I agree. So anyhow, go on. You're the
yeah.
chap asking questions.
Yeah. So, looking back at your career, what is something you would say most people don't realize when it comes to the relationship between science and religion?
I suppose I think a lot of people are hung up on what we call the warfare thesis, that science and religion are natural enemies, and you have to work from there. And of course, there's good reason to think that when you've got people like, on the one hand, Jerry Falwell, and on the other hand, Richard Dawkins, it's hard not to see this as being cast in terms of warfare. But I think I would want to say is, in fact, if you look certainly historically as well as today, you would find that a great many Christians or Jews or Muslims uh, not only have no trouble with evolution, but at some level welcome it because it helps them to develop a more sophisticated understanding of God. That one realizes, for instance, that if indeed one wants to talk about original sin, you can't just do it in terms of Eve eating an apple when she shouldn't have done. I mean, apart from anything else, how ridiculous that we explain Heinrich Himmler in terms of Eve eating a fucking apple. But so, no, seriously. But it doesn't mean to say that that means you can't, if you want to, talk about sin in some sense. And I think that evolutionary biology could be very helpful here because if you look at our evolution, then yes, we are social animals, but also we are. I mean, let's face up to it. I
Yeah.
mean, it, that's the biggest mark of human beings is that we are social animals, and we do get on with each other. But at the same time, there's good reason to think that we're not going to be social all the time. If we meet strangers, we may feel they're a threat, either physically or they want to pinch our women or that sort of thing. And so I could well see why. Well, I think it's true. Why wariness, uh, sometimes even outright hate, is a product of our evolution just as much as is our social nature. Now, if you want to put it all in a God context, I'm fine with that. I mean, if you want to say, well, this is all part of God's working things out or whatever it is, then I have no problem then of saying, yes, at some level, I think original sin, I think we have a built-in capacity, or if you like, willingness or whatever it is to sin. I mean, that we're balanced, we're a mixture, we're nice and nasty. And now the question is, where do we go from there? What can we do, for instance, to harness these things, our knowledge about these things, so that we can start to deal with some of these sorts of things? And so, as a Christian, I could well see that, yeah, what I really want to know is not, I don't want to hide from evolution. I want to explore evolution because I want to know more and more about what evolution thinks and to see how I can mesh this with theology. Maybe I'm going to doubt some of the evolutionary claims. Maybe I'm going to have to say, I think I'm going to have to revise my theological thinking here. And certainly you might want to say, well, I brought up in thinking it's all because Eve ate that fucking apple. But now
Yeah.
I see it's not. But frankly, that's okay. Because if I look at it, there's something absolutely absurd, obscene about the idea that you could explain the Holocaust in terms of a naive young woman eating a bloody apple. I mean,
Right.
now, so as I say, I don't, if I'm a Christian, I would far from look upon evolution. And of course, a lot, I mean, I'm not saying this is what people should do. This is what a huge number of people do.
Yeah.
Who would say, I mean, let's face something. If you were to ask, let's say, the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury or somebody like that about these things, they look at you queer in the head if you said, well, of course you should stay away from evolution. I mean, the Pope might well say, look, I've got other things on my mind, but let's talk about it. Let's think about it.
Yeah.
And at some level, you might want to say to the Pope, well, on the one hand, you've spoken about loving homosexuals and not condemning them. But on the other hand, you want to say that homosexuality is a distortion or something like that. Well, let's talk about this, because that's what we, as responsible people, we should be doing. And if we're made in the image of God, then we ought to be exercising our reason. That's what being made in the image of God is all about. So, I mean, the point is, there have been many, many Christians who take exactly that position. The trouble is, of course, the extremists are the ones who get on Fox News.
Yes, of course. Yep.
I mean, what is it? Dog bites man, it's not news. Man bites dog, it is news. So
Yeah.
that those sorts of things happen.
Yeah, that's true. So the last thing I guess I want to ask you about is, what are you currently working on, and what's the best way to keep track of your work?
Ah, um, well, Amazon.com isn't a bad way to start.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I'm honest about that. Type in Michael-Ruse,
Yep.
and you'll see certainly what my recent books have been, what people are saying about them, and
Yep.
those sorts of things. Um, I wouldn't say every book I write is the same, but I do joke. I think that I've never had a good idea that I haven't used at least 3 times, and
Fair enough.
I think that's true. I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment, as I say, I'm 83. At the moment, I'm thinking possibly this might be the last one. I mean, I'm quite open that basically, as I say, there's nothing in this book which is new. However, the way I'm putting it together in the light of my 50 years of thinking about these things, being a college prof, trying to explain things to people, I'd like to think the way I'm putting it together is giving a whole new perspective. That, if you like, in Aristotle's phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Sure.
And so I'm writing a book on that at the moment. But there's other, as I say, other things. Just these are a couple of little books I brought out in the last year. There's
Yeah.
Cambridge has got a series on evolution of different things. So I've written, they're not full, they're shorties, they're quickers. This one's on the evolution creationism controversy, and this one's on natural selection. Darwin's sort of major force of change.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Cool.
I would want to say, if you want to look at my stuff, start reading it. Start with those. Start with start with that sort of thing. And if you find it interesting, go on. If you want to, drop me a line. Isn't that one of the great things about email? Is
Yeah.
the extent to which we can do this. I mean, for instance, you can reach out to me without having to phone me or meet me or write me letters or anything. You can say, "Hi, Mike. I do these things. I'm Ben. Any
Yeah.
chance of having a session together?" And we agreed there was. And I think it's, despite my computer problems, I think it's been very successful.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Lots of fun.
so
Yeah.
basically, that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share all your knowledge. It's been a lot of fun talking with you. So,
Yeah, it's been fun talking to you too. God knows what's happened to that other computer, but I pay a young man quite a bit of money to do these sorts of things for me.
yeah.
So I'm not worried too much about it. And of course, as you can see, I've got another one, which I was checking. Dear God, this one, for whatever reason, automatically gets everything I'm writing as well, not just my email. I was just checking, I was writing a chapter today. I was worrying that it's all stuck in that one, but it turns out, no, I've got it right here. So
Oh, okay.
you're looking at somebody who's a hell of a lot more relieved than he was 15 minutes ago.
That's good. That's good.
No, seriously, Ben, I love talking to you. I think this has been very profitable.